It was the summer of 1999, and the small town of Mill Creek was alive with the kind of warmth only July can bring. The air smelled faintly of pine and dust, and the hills behind town glowed gold under the afternoon sun. That's where Daniel and Laura, a young couple in their early 20s, had planned their weekend trip, 2 days away from the noise of work, traffic, and the world. Daniel had always loved the outdoors. He worked as a mechanic at his uncle's auto shop, and whenever he could get away, he'd pack up his old green Jeep Cherokee and drive toward the mountains. Laura was different. She liked the outdoors too, but more for the quiet, for the way the forest made her feel small and calm at the same time. Together, they balanced each other. He was the one with the map and the compass. She was the one who reminded him to stop and look at the view. They'd been together since high school, and people around town often said they were that couple, the kind that made love look easy. They were young but already talked about getting married, maybe buying a small house near her parents' place. But before all that, they wanted one last adventure that summer, a weekend alone in the hills, far from everything. On Friday morning, July 16th, they packed the Jeep. Laura brought a small tent, sleeping bags, and a new Polaroid camera she had saved up for. Daniel checked the tires twice and filled the tank. Around noon, they stopped by the gas station on the edge of town. The clerk, a woman named Evelyn, later remembered them clearly. They bought bottled water, trail mix, and a few cans of soda. They laughed about something as they left. She said they seemed happy and in love. It would be the last time anyone saw them. The Sierra Verde hills were beautiful, but tricky. The roads were narrow and curved along the mountains like loose ribbons. Once you left the main road, there was little to no cell signal. Locals often warned travelers not to go too deep into the back roads unless they knew the area well. Daniel had been there once or twice before, but the hills had a way of changing. Dirt paths shifted after storms, and signs were often missing. That Friday night, Daniel's younger brother Adam got a text from him. It was short. Made it to the campsite, all good. No service up here. Back Sunday. Adam didn't think much of it. It sounded like Daniel. But Sunday came and went, and no one heard from them. At first, their families thought they might have stayed an extra night. It wasn't like Daniel and Laura to worry anyone. They both liked the idea of unplugging for a bit. But by Monday evening, when Daniel didn't show up for work and Laura's parents couldn't reach her, concern began to turn into fear. By Tuesday morning, the police were notified. Search and rescue teams were sent into the Sierra Verde hills. Helicopters flew over the valleys. Volunteers combed the trails with flashlights calling out their names. But there was nothing, no tire tracks, no campfire remains, no dropped items, nothing that showed where they had gone. The only clue came from a park ranger who said he saw a green Jeep driving along one of the dirt roads late Friday afternoon, heading toward an area known as Red Hollow, a rough stretch of trail that wound between steep cliffs. It wasn't a dangerous area exactly, but it wasn't well-traveled either. If someone took a wrong turn there, it would be easy to end up miles off course. For days, the search continued. Laura's parents camped near the ranger station, hoping for news. Daniel's brother refused to go home, joining the volunteers on foot. The weather turned bad toward the end of the week. Fog rolled into the hills, and heavy rain made it nearly impossible to see or drive through the narrow trails. After 10 days, the official search was suspended. The sheriff called it one of the most confusing disappearances the county had ever seen. The families didn't give up. Flyers with their photos were pinned to every shop window and gas station board for miles. Local newspapers ran the story for weeks. A few people claimed they had seen a Jeep similar to Daniel's near the state border, but every lead ended in disappointment. The months passed, and the story slowly faded from the headlines. Mill Creek was a small town. Everyone knew everyone. So the couple's disappearance lingered in people's minds like a ghost. Whenever someone drove up to the hills, they'd mention it. You remember that couple who vanished up there years ago? It became one of those unsolved mysteries that everyone had a theory about. Some believed they had gotten lost in the woods and couldn't find their way back. Others thought maybe they had fallen victim to an accident. A road washed out by rain, a car slipping off the side of a hill. But there were darker whispers too. Some said the hills had always been strange, that people had gone missing there before. Laura's best friend Hannah kept her hope alive longer than anyone. Every year on Laura's birthday, she posted the same message online. Still waiting for you to come home. Daniel's brother never changed his phone number, just in case. For them, hope didn't die easily. By the time the year 2000 came around, the case was officially labeled inactive. There were no suspects, no solid evidence, and no reason to believe the couple had met anyone that weekend. They had simply vanished. The Hills kept their secret well, but something about their story stayed with people. Maybe it was how ordinary they were. Two young people in love, just trying to enjoy a weekend away. Maybe it was because there were no answers and no closure. When people don't know what happened, they fill in the gaps with imagination, with possibilities, with what if. Years turned into decades. The green Jeep became a legend in Mill Creek. Locals told newcomers about it the way people talk about ghost stories, with a mix of fear and wonder. Kids dared each other to hike up Red Hollow Road at night, saying if you listened carefully, you could still hear a car engine echoing through the valley. But for the families, it wasn't a story. It was a wound that never really healed. Laura's mother kept a small box under her bed filled with her daughter's things. A hairbrush, a postcard, a photo of her and Daniel smiling at a county fair. She'd sometimes take it out late at night and whisper a prayer, hoping that wherever they were together. In town, people moved on with their lives. The old gas station where they stopped that last day changed owners twice. The Hills were still there, quiet, beautiful, and indifferent. But the memory of the young couple never really went away. Every so often, when the news was slow, local reporters would revisit the case. They'd drive out toward the foothills, stand where the Jeep might have passed, and talk about the mystery that had haunted Mill Creek for 20 years. Back then, no one could have imagined that someday, deep under the same ground where the search had ended, a secret was waiting. One that would finally tell the truth about what really happened to Daniel and Laura that summer in 1999. But that discovery wouldn't come until many years later, when the sound of bulldozers and construction machines would break the silence of the hills, and the mystery would rise, quite literally, from the earth. For now, all anyone knew was that two people went up the mountain one bright July morning and never came back down. The hills swallowed them whole, and the town of Mill Creek was left with nothing but questions. For a long time after Daniel and Laura disappeared, the town of Mill Creek carried a strange silence. People still talked about them now and then, but it was always in hushed tones, as if saying their names too loudly might bring back the pain. The posters with their faces stayed on the notice boards long after the paper had faded and curled from the weather. No one wanted to be the first to take them down. Years passed, and life went on, but the memory of that summer never really left. It was like a shadow that moved quietly through the town, always there in the background. Laura's parents never stopped believing their daughter would come home. Her mother still set a place for her at the dinner table during holidays, even though everyone gently told her it was time to stop. Her father, a quiet man, spent his weekends driving the old trails near the hills just looking. Not because he thought he'd find something after all those years, but because sitting at home felt worse. Daniel's brother, Adam, carried his own guilt. He had always thought of his big brother as invincible, the one who could fix anything, who never got lost, who always had a plan. In the early years, Adam joined search groups and hiking clubs, hoping someone, anyone, might stumble upon a clue. But eventually, even he had to accept there was nothing left to find. As the years rolled on, stories began to grow around their disappearance. Some were harmless, others not so much. People love mysteries, especially in small towns, where every bit of news spreads fast. Some said Daniel and Laura had decided to run away and start fresh somewhere new. Maybe they were tired of small-town life. Maybe they wanted to disappear on purpose. Others whispered darker theories. Maybe they had met someone dangerous out in the hills, or maybe something strange had happened to them that couldn't be explained. But none of those stories had proof. They were just stories, passed around like campfire tales. By 2005, the case had become a local legend. The hills where they vanished, the Sierra Verde Hills, began to attract curious hikers, amateur, investigators, and even a few journalists hoping to make a name for themselves. A couple of documentaries were made about unsolved disappearances, and Daniel and Laura's names always came up. Their smiling faces taken from the same old photo, standing by the Jeep, his arm around her shoulders, became a familiar image on television screens. But for the families, the attention didn't make things easier. Every time their story came up in the news, it reopened old wounds. Laura's mother stopped giving interviews. She didn't want to hear strangers talk about her daughter as a mystery or a headline. To her, Laura wasn't a story. She was her child, the one who used to sing while doing the dishes, the one who loved vanilla ice cream and wrote letters she never mailed. Still, no one could deny how strange the case was. Search teams had gone through every possible trail, every ravine and every dry creek bed, yet nothing had been found. Not a piece of clothing, not a license plate, not even a single footprint that could be confirmed as theirs. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them. Around 2010, a new sheriff came into office, younger, more determined, and with access to newer technology. He reopened the case, hoping that maybe with updated satellite images or mapping software, something would show up. But again, nothing. The terrain was too dense, too wild. The hills had changed shape after years of weather and landslides. What might have been a trail in 1999 could be covered with trees and rock by now. Meanwhile, Mill Creek began to change too. The once small and quiet town started to grow. New shops opened, tourists came for the hiking trails, and slowly the story of Daniel and Laura became something the newcomers only half remembered. For many, it was just an old story. But for the people who had lived there back then, it was part of the town's soul, an unanswered question that lingered every time someone drove past the road leading into the hills. There were still reminders everywhere. The gas station where they had stopped that day still stood, though it had a new owner and a fresh coat of paint. Some locals said the place felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the years had washed away the heaviness. But for Evelyn, the old clerk who still lived nearby, the memory was crystal clear. She often told her granddaughter about the young couple with bright smiles and kind eyes who had stopped for gas that summer day. She remembered Laura laughing, holding a map that fluttered in the wind, and Daniel joking about how he never trusted directions. Every now and then, someone new would come into town claiming to have a lead. A man once said he found a car door deep in the woods, but it turned out to be from a junked pickup. Another hiker claimed to have found a piece of jewelry, but it belonged to someone else. Every tip ended the same way: disappointment. Still, the families held on to hope, even if only in small ways. Laura's mother planted a tree in her daughter's honor near the town park. Daniel's brother became a firefighter, saying it helped him cope with the feeling of helplessness he had carried for years. They moved forward, but the past never really left. In 2015, a group of college students made a podcast about local mysteries. They called it The Vanishing Trail. Their first episode was about Daniel and Laura. They visited the hills, interviewed locals, and even went through the old police files. Their calm, curious tone caught people's attention, and for a while the story found new life. Comments poured in online, some from listeners who claimed to know something, others simply sharing sympathy. The internet had a way of bringing old mysteries back to life. But even with all the digital tools, drones, and data, nothing new came out of it. The hills stayed quiet. The mystery stayed sealed. That same year, there was a small reunion at Mill Creek High School. Daniel and Laura would have both been in their early 40s by then. Their classmates gathered in the school gym, trading stories about where life had taken them. Someone brought up the couple, how full of dreams they had been, how they talked about seeing the world. A long pause followed. Even after all those years, people still didn't know what to say. It was strange how time worked. 20 years had passed, and yet for the families it still felt like yesterday. The pain had dulled, yes, but it never vanished completely. Sometimes Laura's mother would wake up in the middle of the night, certain she had heard footsteps on the porch or a car door closing outside. For a brief second, she'd imagine Laura walking up the driveway, tired but smiling, saying she was finally home. But when she looked out the window, there was only darkness and the sound of the wind. In 2019, things began to change in Mill Creek once again. The county approved a project to build a new highway extension, one that would cut through part of the Sierra Verde Hills to make travel easier between towns. The locals had mixed feelings about it. Some were excited for the business it would bring. Others hated the idea of carving into the same hills that held so many memories. At first, no one thought much about the area the construction crews would be working in. It was an old rocky section that had always been too rough for hiking. But one of the marked zones on the project map included a stretch near Red Hollow, the same road Daniel and Laura were believed to have taken that weekend in 1999. As bulldozers rolled in and workers began clearing the ground, the noise of machinery echoed through the valley, a sound the hills hadn't heard in decades. Dust clouds rose where silence had once reigned. And though no one knew it yet, those same machines were about to uncover something that had been hidden for 20 long years. It would start as just another workday. A few men setting up equipment, joking over coffee, unaware that beneath the dirt and stone lay the answers to a mystery that had haunted Mill Creek for a generation. For now, the story still belonged to the past, to faded photographs, empty chairs at family dinners, and unanswered questions. But soon, the hills would finally give up their secret, and when they did, it would change everything the town thought it knew about that summer in 1999. It was a bright morning in early spring of 2019 when the construction crews started work on the new highway extension near Mill Creek. The project had been in planning for years, and now the sound of heavy machinery filled the air. Excavators dug through layers of dirt and rock, and trucks carried away piles of soil from the old hillside. For the workers, it was just another job. The sun was warm and the scent of fresh earth mixed with diesel and sweat. Most of the crew were locals, people who had grown up hearing about the story of the young couple who vanished 20 years earlier. But no one expected to find anything. To them, that story had become something from the past, a ghost from another time. That morning, a small team was assigned to clear an uneven section of ground near the edge of a ravine. The spot had been hard to reach for years because of fallen rocks and thick bushes. The foreman wanted it flattened before the new foundation was laid. The machines moved slowly, carving through layers of soil that hadn't been touched in decades. Then, just before noon, one of the bulldozer operators noticed something odd. A small glint beneath the dirt, something metallic. At first he thought it was just a piece of scrap metal left behind from old farm equipment. But as the machine scraped a little more, a curved shape began to appear, something that looked like part of a vehicle's frame. The foreman called for the machines to stop. Dust settled in the air as a few workers walked over to take a closer look. They started digging carefully with shovels, brushing away dirt with their gloves. Within minutes, a clearer outline appeared. It was unmistakable, a roof, crushed and half buried under rocks. One of the men stepped back, his voice quiet but certain. "That's a car." Word spread quickly across the site. The county sheriff's office was notified, and soon, a few patrol cars arrived. The area was roped off while investigators and forensic teams began to dig more carefully. Bit by bit, the rest of the vehicle came into view. The rusted body of an old green Jeep, its windows broken, its front end wedged deep into the earth. No one said it out loud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. When the license plate was uncovered, an officer read out the numbers. A silence followed. The plate matched the one from the missing vehicle, Daniel's Jeep. For a long moment, no one moved. Even the sound of the machinery stopped. The air felt heavy, as if the hills themselves were holding their breath. The news spread through Mill Creek faster than anyone could have imagined. Within hours, reporters showed up, cameras flashing near the construction site. People gathered along the fence line, whispering and pointing. After 20 years of silence, the mystery that had haunted the town was suddenly alive again. The sheriffs, Office confirmed that the Jeep had been found in a deep ravine, hidden by years of landslides and thick brush. From the road above, there had never been any sign of it. The vehicle had been crushed by fallen rocks, making it nearly invisible even to aerial searches. As the investigators worked, they found more inside, small pieces of a life frozen in time. A camping stove, a torn backpack, and an old Polaroid camera, covered in dirt but still intact. Inside the Jeep, 2 sets of remains were discovered. The sheriff didn't need to say who they were. Everyone already knew. The remains were carefully taken to the coroner's office, while forensic experts began to piece together what had happened. It appeared the Jeep had slipped off the narrow road sometime during the night, tumbling down the ravine before coming to rest between rocks. The fall was steep, and once the car landed, it was completely hidden from view. The thick trees and lack of phone signal had made it impossible for anyone to find them back then. For the families, the discovery was heartbreaking, but also brought something they hadn't had in 20 years, an answer. Daniel's brother, now in his 40s, stood by the sheriff as they gave a small press conference. He didn't say much, just that it felt strange to finally know the truth. "We spent so long wondering," he said softly, "and now, at least we can bring them home." Laura's mother was quiet when she heard the news. Neighbors said she sat for a long time at her kitchen table, just holding one of her daughter's old photos. She told a friend later that night, "I always felt she was still out there waiting to be found. Now she finally is." The camera found inside the Jeep became a point of great interest. It was sent to specialists to see if the film could be restored. Against all odds, a few of the photos inside were still visible. They showed Daniel and Laura at their campsite, smiling, cooking, and posing in front of their tent. There was even one photo of the sunset over the hills, golden and soft. The final picture, though, was different. It was blurry, as if it had been taken quickly. It showed headlights in the distance shining through a patch of fog. The photo sparked countless conversations online. Some people thought it was just another car they had seen on the trail. Others said it looked like the lights from their own Jeep reflecting in the mist. Whatever it was, it became a haunting reminder of the last moments they might have captured. For the investigators, the case was finally clear. There was no sign of foul play. The Jeep had likely slipped during a rainstorm or in low visibility, and with the steep drop and dense terrain, no one could have survived the fall. It was a tragic accident, one that had remained hidden for 2 decades. When the official report was released, the sheriff held a small press meeting in front of the courthouse. He spoke carefully, saying, "The Hills kept their secret for a long time. Today we're finally able to bring peace to 2 families and close a chapter that has stayed open far too long." The town responded with a mix of sorrow and relief. People left flowers near the trailhead where Daniel and Laura had last been seen. Old friends reunited, sharing stories of who they were, remembering their laughter, their kindness, the way they had loved each other so easily. For Mill Creek, the discovery meant the end of one of its longest mysteries. The hills that had once been a symbol of beauty and silence were now something else, a place of memory, where life and loss intertwined. In the weeks that followed, the construction crews returned to work, but things felt different. The workers moved more slowly, more respectfully, as if they understood that the ground they were cutting into held more than just rock and dirt. It held stories. One worker later said that after the Jeep was removed, the valley seemed quieter, calmer. "It's like the hills can rest now," he said, like they were holding on to something for too long. The families arranged a small memorial service near the base of the ravine. Only close friends and relatives were invited. There were no news cameras, no reporters, just soft music, a few candles, and 2 framed photos, Daniel and Laura smiling side by side, forever young. When the service ended, Daniel's brother placed a small wooden cross near the spot where the Jeep had been found. He didn't say much, only whispered a few words that no one else could hear. Laura's mother placed a wildflower on the ground beside it. The wind blew gently through the trees, carrying the sound of rustling leaves and soft, peaceful, almost like a sigh. After 20 long years, the story of the young couple who vanished in the hills finally had an ending. It wasn't the one anyone wanted, but it was the truth. And for Mill Creek, that truth changed everything. It reminded people how fragile life can be, how one wrong turn on a quiet night can change everything. But it also reminded them of love. of how deeply two people could care for each other, and how even after decades, their memory could still bring a town together. In the months after the discovery, the highway project finished as planned, but the workers built a small lookout point along the new road. From there, you could see the valley where the Jeep had been found. A small plaque was placed on the railing engraved with simple words, "In memory of Daniel and Laura, lost in the hills, found at last." Whenever travelers stopped there, they would read the inscription, look out at the wide stretch of green below, and fall silent for a moment. It was a peaceful place and the kind of quiet that felt like understanding. The hills of Mill Creek no longer felt like they were keeping a secret. They had told their story at last, and in doing so, they gave peace to two souls who had waited far too long to be found. The weeks after the discovery felt strange for the people of Mill Creek. It was as if time had slowed down. Everyone talked about the same thing: the Jeep, the camera, the photos, the final discovery. The town had waited 2 decades for answers, and now that they finally had them, no one quite knew what to do next. For the families, it was a quiet kind of closure. After the memorial service, life didn't suddenly go back to normal. There was relief, but also emptiness. The years of waiting, hoping, and wondering had been replaced by silence. For so long, every phone call or knock at the door had carried a small spark of hope. Now that hope was gone, and in its place was the weight of reality. Daniel's brother Adam spent a lot of time near the new lookout point that had been built along the highway. He'd drive up there after work, park his truck, and just sit watching the hills as the sun went down. Some evenings, hikers or travelers would stop there too, reading the plaque and talking quietly among themselves. They didn't know him, but he didn't mind. He liked hearing people say their names out loud again, Daniel and Laura, as if keeping them alive in memory. Laura's mother, though, found it harder to move on. For 20 years she had lived with questions, with endless what-ifs. Now that she knew the truth, she felt both peace and sorrow. She visited the cemetery often, bringing fresh flowers every Sunday. Sometimes she'd sit on the bench and talk to her daughter softly, the way she used to when Laura was little. She'd tell her about the seasons changing, about the new bakery that had opened in town, about how she was still missed every single day. The sheriff's office kept the case open for a few months longer, while the final reports were completed. They wanted to be certain about every detail. Forensic specialists confirmed that the Jeep had most likely gone off the road during a foggy night. The area was known for sudden mist that rolled down from the mountains, and the narrow dirt road near Red Hollow had no guardrails. Investigators studied the old weather records. From that weekend in July 1999, it showed that a heavy storm had passed through the region on the night the couple disappeared. The rain had been strong enough to cause minor landslides and wash away parts of the road. Most likely, Daniel had been driving carefully but lost visibility. A single wrong turn in the dark would have been enough to send the Jeep sliding off the edge. When the car hit the rocks below, the steepness of the ravine and the layers of loose soil covered it within days. The thick vegetation that grew afterward made it almost impossible to see, even from above. Search teams had flown helicopters over the area back then, but the Jeep had been buried too deep. It wasn't anyone's fault. It was simply nature hiding what it didn't want found. When the final report was released, it brought a kind of finality to the story. The sheriff called both families personally before sharing it with the public. He told them gently that it was, without question, an accident. No foul play, no hidden story, just a tragic twist of fate. Daniel's brother thanked him quietly and said, "At least we know they were together." That sentence stuck with the sheriff long after he hung up the phone. It summed up everything: the years of pain, the mystery, and the love that had outlasted it all. A few weeks later, the news spread to nearby towns and even made national headlines. Articles were written about the discovery, about how modern construction had accidentally solved a 20-year-old mystery. Some of the stories were dramatic, but the local paper told it best. Simply, and with care. They published a front-page photo of the hills at sunset with the caption, "Found at last. The long search for Daniel and Laura ends where it began." People began visiting Mill Creek just to see the lookout point. Some left flowers. Others left handwritten notes tucked under the plaque. One person left a small Polaroid photo of their own family with a message that read, "Your story reminded us to hold on to each other." The story touched people because it wasn't about tragedy alone. It was about love, memory, and the strange kindness of time. In the months that followed, the construction workers who had discovered the Jeep were invited to a small-town dinner at the community hall. It wasn't formal, just a gesture of thanks from the locals. Many of the workers said they still thought about that day. One of them admitted he sometimes couldn't stop thinking about how close the Jeep had been to where they had first started digging. Just a few feet in another direction, he said, and we might have missed it forever. Life slowly began to return to normal in Mill Creek, but the town wasn't quite the same. The hills no longer felt haunted by unanswered questions. Instead, they felt sacred, a place where two lives had quietly rested for years until the earth itself decided it was time to be found. At the same time, the discovery made people in town look at life differently. They talked more kindly to each other. They called their loved ones more often. Small things that once felt ordinary suddenly mattered again. One afternoon, months later, Adam received a small package in the mail. Inside was a restored print of one of the Polaroid photos found in the Jeep. It showed Daniel and Laura sitting together by their campfire, smiling at the camera. Behind them, the sun was setting over the hills, painting the sky in gold and orange. Attached to the photo was a short note from the forensic team that had worked on it. It said, "We thought you might like to have this." They looked happy. Adam framed the photo and hung it in his living room. Every morning before leaving for work, he'd glance at it, and every night before bed, he'd turn off the light beneath it. It wasn't sadness he felt anymore, just quiet love. For Laura's mother, healing came slowly. It wasn't something that happened all at once. It came in small ways, through memories shared with friends, through the laughter of grandchildren who never got to meet their aunt, and through the kindness of strangers who still remembered her daughter's story. She once said to a neighbor, "People think time heals everything, but really it's love that does. It just takes time for love to outweigh the pain." As the first anniversary of the discovery approached, the town decided to hold a remembrance walk. People gathered at the base of the hills and followed the old trail toward the lookout point. There were no speeches, just candles and quiet music playing from a single speaker. When they reached the top, everyone stood silently for a few minutes, looking out at the valley below. The air was cool and still. Someone started humming softly, an old tune that Laura used to sing. Slowly, others joined in. The sound rose gently through the evening air, drifting down into the ravine as if the hills themselves were listening. The event became a tradition after that. Every year, people came to the lookout point on that same evening to light candles and remember. It wasn't just about Daniel and Laura anymore. It became a way for people to remember anyone they had lost, anyone whose story had ended too soon. The story of the young couple from Mill Creek became something larger than a local legend. It turned into a reminder of how fragile life is, how unpredictable the world can be, and how love, even after decades of silence, can still be found in the most unexpected ways. When travelers passed through Mill Creek and stopped at the lookout, they didn't just see a valley or a plaque. They saw a story. They saw proof that even when the world forgets, the earth remembers. And sometimes, after many years, it gently reveals what it has been keeping safe all along. The hills, once heavy with mystery, now felt peaceful. The sound of wind through the pines, the rustle of leaves, the soft hum of the highway, it all blended into something calm and beautiful. Daniel and Laura's story didn't end with their disappearance. It ended here, in the warmth of memory, in the quiet gratitude of a town that finally understood what it meant to find peace. A year had passed since the discovery, and Mill Creek had settled back into its quiet rhythm. The hills looked the same as they always had, peaceful and green. But for the people who had lived through the mystery, nothing truly felt the same. The story of Daniel and Laura had changed them. It had reminded everyone how fragile time was, how love could stretch across decades, and how sometimes closure arrives when no one expects it. The lookout point that had been built above the ravine had become a small but meaningful part of town life. Travelers stopped there to take pictures, families came on weekends to enjoy the view, and locals often left flowers by the plaque. There was something calming about that place. It didn't feel sad. It felt gentle, as if the air carried the memory of two people who had once stood in those same hills, full of life and laughter. Daniel's brother Adam still visited often. Sometimes he brought a cup of coffee and sat quietly on the bench overlooking the valley. He didn't come out of grief anymore. He came because it felt peaceful there, like sitting beside an old friend. He had made peace with what had happened, though there were still moments when the memories caught him off guard. A familiar smell of pine, a song on the radio, the way sunlight hit the hills just right. He once told a reporter who revisited the story, "You never really stop missing someone. But after a while, you stop feeling lost about it. You start remembering them in ways that make you smile again." Laura's mother had grown more at ease too. The pain never went away completely, but it softened. Every year, she made a habit of visiting the lookout on the same weekend that her daughter and Daniel had left for their trip back in 1999. She'd bring fresh flowers and sit for a while, watching the sunset the way Laura used to love. Sometimes she'd talk out loud as if her daughter were sitting beside her. Other times she'd simply close her eyes and listen to the wind moving through the trees. The town, too, found its own way to honor them. Every spring, the local high school held a small essay contest called the Journey Award. Students were asked to write about someone who inspired them or about a journey that taught them something important. The award wasn't big, just a certificate and a small scholarship, but it became a tradition. The idea had come from one of Laura's old teachers, who remembered her love for writing and her sense of wonder about the world. One of the winning essays that first year was written by a girl who had never met Daniel or Laura, but had grown up hearing their story. She wrote, "They went to the hills to find peace, and even though they never came back, they still brought it to all of us." The words touched everyone who read them. The hills around Mill Creek continued to draw visitors, hikers, photographers, and those who just wanted to see the place that had carried a story for so long. Some came out of curiosity, but most came for reflection. The air up there always seemed clearer, quieter, almost sacred. Over time, the mystery became less about the disappearance and more about what it had meant. People began to see it not as a tragedy, but as a reminder. A story about love, youth, and the fragile beauty of life. A few years later, the highway that had uncovered the Jeep was officially completed. On the day of its opening, a small ribbon-cutting ceremony was held. The mayor gave a short speech about progress and community, but he ended by talking about Daniel and Laura. He said, "This road connects more than two towns. It connects past and present, and it reminds us that even the hardest stories can bring people together." Those words stayed with many who attended that day. After the ceremony, Adam drove along the new highway for the first time. He rolled down the windows and let the warm air rush in. The curves of the road passed through places that had once been hidden and wild. When he reached the lookout point, he pulled over. The valley stretched out before him, quiet and endless. He took a deep breath, feeling the peace of it all. He thought about his brother, the laughter, the teasing, the way he used to whistle while fixing cars. He thought about Laura, too, how her kindness had balanced Daniel's stubbornness, how she'd always carried a small notebook where she wrote poems and plans for the future. They had been young, full of dreams, and though their time had been short, their story had become part of something lasting. Adam smiled to himself and whispered, "You found your way home after all." Over time, nature began to reclaim the place where the Jeep had been found. The construction crew had cleared the area carefully, and now, new grass and small wildflowers had grown over the disturbed ground. The earth had healed, just like the people. One afternoon, a few children from town were playing near the hills with their parents. One of them pointed at the lookout sign and asked, "Who are Daniel and Laura?" The father knelt beside his son and said softly, "They were two people who loved each other very much and got lost up there a long time ago. But they were found again, and now they rest where they can see the whole valley." The child nodded, satisfied with that answer, and ran off to play again. In that moment, it became clear that their story would never really fade. It would live on, told gently from one generation to the next, not as a ghost story, but as a lesson in love, hope, and patience. Years later, long after the highway had become just another road on the map, people still stopped at the lookout point. Couples on road trips, hikers, families, and even truck drivers passing through, all drawn by the view and the quiet that seemed to fill the air. Some would sit for a while, not knowing the full story but sensing something special about that place. They'd stand by the railing, feel the wind on their faces, and read the words on the plaque. Lost in the hills, found at last, and maybe they'd think about someone they missed, someone they hadn't seen in years. Maybe they'd promise themselves to call that person when they got home. Or maybe they'd just smile and move on, carrying with them a small reminder that even after years of silence, love has a way of finding its way back. Mill Creek eventually grew into a larger town. New houses were built, new families arrived, and the old main street got busier. But no matter how much changed, the heart of the town stayed the same. People remembered. They always would. Sometimes when the evening light fell over the hills, the valley would glow in soft gold, the same color it had been that summer in 1999. The wind would pass through the pines, and if you stood very still, you could almost imagine hearing the faint laughter of two young voices, far away but never gone. The hills no longer held secrets. They held stories. They held memories. They held peace. For the people of Mill Creek, the story of Daniel and Laura wasn't about tragedy anymore. It was about the way love leaves a mark, even after time, even after loss. It was about how a small town carried their memory for 20 years and how, in the end, the hills themselves gave them back. And somewhere, in that vast stretch of quiet sky and endless green, their story lived on, simple, timeless, and whole.